In this episode, we focus on a part of security operations that sounds boring at first, but quietly determines whether a security operations center, SOC, becomes trusted and effective or turns into a noisy factory that looks busy while getting little done. Metrics are supposed to help you understand performance and improve it, yet many teams end up measuring the easiest thing to count instead of the thing that matters. That is how you get ticket volume theater, where success is defined by how many alerts were touched, how many cases were closed, or how fast something was moved to the next queue. For a beginner, the key idea is that counting activity is not the same as measuring quality, and in security, the cost of being wrong can be high even when everyone is working hard. Good metrics act like a steering wheel, helping the team notice drift and correct it early, while bad metrics act like a treadmill, pushing people to run faster without changing where they are going. By the end, you should be able to describe what quality looks like in an SOC, why volume-based metrics can distort behavior, and how to choose measures that lead to better detection and response over time. The first step is to define what quality means in security operations, because without a definition you will default to whatever is easiest to count. Quality in an SOC is not just speed, and it is not just accuracy, because the job requires balancing both under uncertainty. Quality includes making correct decisions about what is real and what is noise, escalating appropriately, preserving useful evidence, communicating clearly, and learning from outcomes so the same issues do not repeat. It also includes consistency, meaning that different analysts should reach similar conclusions when given the same evidence and context. Beginners often imagine that security is about certainty, but operations work is about making the best decision you can with incomplete information and then improving your ability to do that tomorrow. A quality-focused team produces fewer surprise incidents, fewer missed serious events, and fewer wasted hours chasing harmless activity. This is why the best measures often connect to outcomes and decision confidence, not just to the number of items processed. Once you can say what good looks like, you can pick metrics that reward the behaviors that create that result. Ticket volume theater happens when the metric becomes the goal, and people start optimizing the number rather than the security outcome. If you tell a team that closing tickets quickly is the main measure of success, they will close tickets quickly, but that does not guarantee that the right tickets were escalated or that the right evidence was gathered. This is not because people are dishonest, but because humans naturally align effort with what is rewarded, especially in stressful environments. Volume metrics can also encourage shallow work, like minimal notes, quick dismissals, and unnecessary escalations, because those behaviors move items through the system faster. In the long run, that increases noise, reduces trust from other teams, and makes incidents harder to manage because the record of what happened is incomplete. Beginners should notice that the most dangerous operational failures often look efficient in the moment because they hide risk by moving it downstream. When metrics reward speed without quality, you end up with an SOC that appears productive while quietly degrading the organization's ability to detect and respond. The problem is not measuring at all, but measuring the wrong thing and then treating it as a scorecard instead of a guide. A better approach is to separate leading indicators from lagging indicators, even if you do not use those terms explicitly. Some measures tell you about outcomes after the fact, such as whether an incident caused damage, while other measures tell you about the health of your process while work is happening. In an SOC, you need both, because outcomes can be rare and you still need to manage daily performance. A simple example is that the number of confirmed incidents might be low in a given month, but that does not necessarily mean the SOC is effective, because it could mean the SOC is missing things. On the other hand, if you only look at daily activity, you can miss the deeper question of whether decisions are correct and whether the organization is getting safer. Quality metrics often mix process health, such as the completeness of investigations, with outcome signals, such as reduced repeat alerts for the same cause. Beginners can think of this like healthcare, where a doctor does not only measure how many patients were seen, but also whether treatments work and whether patients return with the same problem. When you blend process and outcome measures, you can guide improvement without falling into the trap of celebrating motion for its own sake. One of the most powerful quality measures for detection work is a form of precision, meaning how often alerts represent real security-relevant activity rather than harmless noise. You do not need advanced math to understand this, because the practical version is simply asking, when the SOC spends time on alerts, how many of those alerts end up being meaningful? If most alerts are false alarms, the team will burn time and trust, and analysts will become numb, which increases the chance that a real incident is missed. If alerts are too rare because thresholds are overly strict, the team may miss early warning signs, which leads to later discovery with greater damage. A quality-focused metric might track the proportion of alerts that are confirmed as worth investigating, not to punish the team, but to reveal whether the detection system is tuned to reality. Another useful measure is the reduction of repeated false positives over time, because that indicates learning and improvement instead of endless repetition. Beginners should recognize that good operations is not about suffering through noise heroically. It is about systematically reducing noise so attention can be spent on what matters. When you measure precision and improvement, you encourage the team to make the alert stream smarter rather than larger. Another major quality dimension is decision correctness, which shows up in how often the SOC makes the right call about severity and escalation. A practical way to think about this is to examine cases after they are closed and ask whether the conclusion matched what later evidence showed. If a case was dismissed and later turned out to be an incident, that is a high-cost error, while if a case was escalated as urgent and later proved harmless, that is also costly because it disrupts operations and damages trust. Quality metrics can capture this by tracking reopens, reversals, and unnecessary escalations, not to blame individuals, but to identify patterns that training and detections can improve. This is also where consistency matters, because if different analysts classify similar events differently, leadership cannot predict how the system will behave. A mature team will perform regular reviews of a sample of cases to check decision quality, much like a teacher checks student work to see whether the lesson is landing. Beginners should notice that correctness is not just a personal skill. It is a system outcome shaped by playbooks, evidence standards, and clarity about what different severities mean. Measuring decision quality encourages investment in those foundations rather than in superficial speed. Time-based metrics are still useful, but they must be framed carefully so they measure response effectiveness rather than haste. For example, it is meaningful to measure time to acknowledge a high-severity signal because delays can allow threats to spread. It is also meaningful to measure time to contain a confirmed incident, but only if containment is defined clearly and does not encourage reckless actions. The danger is measuring average time to close tickets, because averages can hide the difference between easy and hard cases and can pressure analysts to close complex cases prematurely. A better time metric focuses on key milestones, such as time to initial triage, time to reach a confident classification, and time to escalate when escalation criteria are met. Beginners should understand that security response is like emergency response. You want speed, but you want the right speed in the right moments, not indiscriminate rushing. You also want to identify bottlenecks, such as waiting on a system owner or lacking access to evidence, because those are process problems rather than analyst effort problems. When time metrics are tied to milestones and context, they can guide improvements in workflow and coordination without turning the team into a ticket-closing machine. Evidence and documentation quality are often overlooked, but they are central to trust and learning, so they deserve measurement in a mature SOC. When a case is closed, the organization should be able to understand what happened, why the decision was made, and what evidence supports it. If case notes are thin or inconsistent, the next analyst cannot learn from them, and leaders cannot audit the quality of decisions. Documentation is also essential during incidents when multiple teams need a shared picture and when legal or compliance requirements may apply. A quality-focused metric might assess completeness of case records against a standard, such as whether the timeline is clear, whether key artifacts were captured, and whether the rationale for decisions is explicit. This kind of review can be done on samples rather than on every case, which keeps it practical while still driving improvement. Beginners should realize that documentation is not a paperwork chore. It is the memory of the operation, and operations without memory repeat mistakes. Measuring evidence quality reinforces that the SOC is expected to produce defensible, teachable work, not just activity. Another meaningful quality area is analyst confidence and reduction of uncertainty over time, which might sound subjective but can be turned into practical signals. If analysts repeatedly express uncertainty about certain alert types, or if similar alerts repeatedly require escalation for basic clarification, that suggests gaps in training, unclear procedures, or poor detection design. A team can track which alert categories cause the most confusion, which cases take the longest to classify, and which ones are most often reworked. These are signals of where improvement will have the biggest payoff, because they identify friction points in the system. Beginners sometimes assume that uncertainty is bad and should be hidden, but in operations, naming uncertainty is how you reduce it responsibly. A healthy SOC makes uncertainty visible and then invests in reducing it through better signals, better context, and clearer playbooks. If metrics only reward speed and volume, analysts will hide uncertainty and make rushed calls, which increases risk. Metrics that highlight uncertainty patterns encourage the team to build confidence the right way, through learning and better process, rather than through guesswork. Metrics should also reflect the broader organizational impact of the SOC, because security operations does not exist in a vacuum. One important indicator is whether escalations are actionable and helpful to the teams receiving them, because that is where SOC credibility is built. If other teams routinely complain that escalations lack evidence or are too frequent and low value, the SOC may be consuming organizational attention without reducing risk. Another impact measure is whether repeat incidents decline for the same underlying causes, because that suggests the SOC is driving learning and remediation rather than just detecting. You can also look at how often the SOC identifies control gaps, such as missing logging for critical systems, and whether those gaps get addressed over time. Beginners should see that a strong SOC improves the organization's security posture by influencing upstream fixes, not just by responding downstream. When you measure impact, you encourage collaboration and continuous improvement, because the SOC becomes a partner in strengthening defenses rather than a source of endless tickets. Impact metrics also help leadership understand the return on investment in operations, which supports sustained funding and maturity. To avoid volume theater, it helps to design metrics that are hard to game and that encourage balanced behavior. One simple principle is to measure a mix of speed, accuracy, and improvement, because focusing on only one dimension creates predictable distortions. Another principle is to prefer rates and trends over raw counts, because raw counts can increase simply because the environment changed or because detections became noisier. It is also important to review metrics in a learning-oriented way rather than using them as a blunt weapon, because fear-driven metrics lead to hiding problems instead of fixing them. Beginners should understand that metrics are a feedback system, and feedback systems work only when people trust that the goal is improvement. A mature SOC uses metrics to ask better questions, like why a certain alert category is noisy, why investigations stall, or why severity assignments vary. Those questions lead to targeted changes in training, detections, and workflows, which is how security operations improves over time. Metrics that spark useful conversations are almost always more valuable than metrics that produce impressive-looking charts. When you put all of this together, setting SOC metrics is less about finding the perfect number and more about building a measurement set that keeps the team aligned with quality outcomes. Ticket volume is easy to count, but it can reward shallow work and create the illusion of progress, which is why it often becomes theater instead of truth. Quality-centered metrics focus on how often alerts are meaningful, how correct and consistent decisions are, how quickly the team reaches key milestones without rushing, and how well evidence is captured for trust and learning. They also look outward at impact, such as whether escalations help other teams and whether repeat problems decline because the organization is improving. The best metric sets are balanced, trend-focused, and used as feedback rather than as punishment, because security operations depends on honest visibility into what is working and what is failing. For a beginner, the most important takeaway is that what you measure becomes what you build. So if you measure motion, you get motion, and if you measure quality, you get quality. An SOC that escapes ticket volume theater does so by treating metrics as a compass, not as a scoreboard, and by insisting that the numbers point toward better decisions and safer outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.